Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I'd like to get started. My name is Homi Karas. I'm a senior fellow and the deputy director of the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. And it's a wonderful honor and privilege for me to moderate this panel on, I think, a really important topic, which is promoting shared societies and to take that vision and think about exactly what it means for a very broad discussion on the post-2015 agenda, which is continuing to go on. So let me first introduce our panel. It's a star-studded panel. You all have the bios in the sheet that was distributed. I'll just go in order. The Honorable Wim Kok is a two-term former Prime Minister of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but he has also been the Chairman of the European Trade Union Confederation, Deputy Chairman of the Socio-Economic Council, so somebody, I think, who has spent a large part of his life thinking and implementing, hopefully, these issues. The Honorable Kim Campbell is also a former Prime Minister, excuse me, of Canada. She's served as president of the International Women's Forum, so she's taken a very active role in promoting leadership of one group that's often described as being marginalized, but is certainly perhaps faces a number of barriers, but certainly are not marginal groups in our society. The Honorable Kassam Utim is also a two-term former president of the Republic of Mauritius. He has come up with as a local community worker. He's a former mayor of a large city, and he's currently also a board member of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Welcome. Santiago Levy. Santiago is a Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank. He's also served as Deputy Minister of in the Ministry of Finance in Mexico, but he's probably better known, at least to many of us here, as a non-resident senior fellow of Brookings, who authored a tremendous book called Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes. He is the architect of perhaps the most famous safety net program in the world, Progreso Oportunidades in Mexico, and was both the intellectual and practical force behind its implementation. And at the far end is Mr. John Podesta. Mr. Podesta is here as a former member of the high-level panel of the advising the UN Secretary General on the post-2015 agenda. He's also currently a counselor to President Obama, dealing specifically with climate change and energy, a former chair of the Center for American Progress, and of course also a former chief of staff to President Bill Clinton. So welcome, everybody. I think it's just an extraordinary panel. So the format for today is that we'll first have a panel discussion, and for about 40 minutes or so. Then I'll open it up to the floor for questions and answers. This event is being webcast. If you would like to tweet, you should please use the hashtag Shared Societies. For those of you who are not in the room but who might be hearing what I'm saying, if you would like to ask questions on Twitter, just use that hashtag. Somebody will be monitoring it, and we'll try to incorporate those questions into the Q&A session. So with that, let's get started. And Mr. Koch, maybe I can just start with you. Really the core of the position paper that the Club de Madrid produced on the post-2015 agenda. The core, I would say, of that paper is that the marginalization of many groups has really hindered the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. And so if we're going to come out with a new set of sustainable development goals, we had better put these groups really at the heart of the agenda. And that's a very powerful argument, but just to play the devil's advocate, let me say that, many politicians tend to think not of the marginalized groups, but of the interests of the median voter or the median household who might be more concerned about growth than about marginalization. So why do you think that it's so important to really address issues of marginalized groups?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Perhaps first a few short words of introduction, who the Club of Madrid is, and the link between the Club of Madrid and the Shared Societies agenda and now the post-2015 development goals. Club of Madrid is the largest global forum of former leaders, former heads of state and governments all over the world, almost 100, democratically elected, making their time and energy available to advise current leaders and provide a kind of convening platform for discussion on current global and regional challenges, all related to democracy and democratic transition. We came to the conclusion already a number of years ago that the concept of shared societies is crucial for developed and developing countries, for regions to make the best possible use of the potential of each and every individual, regardless religion, ethnic background, etc. And we came to the conclusion that shared societies has also pays an economic dividend. So it's not just for intrinsic reasons, but also for economic reasons, that it's useful and essential for a country, for a society to be inclusive. Coming now to your question, your first question on the Millennium Development Goals. I think it's clear that the marginalization or the underutilization of the input of individuals, marginalized groups in society, has a negative effect on the realization of development goals. But the situation is even more serious, because the way in which the Millennium Development Goals have been used makes it possible that some people might say, yes, okay, this country has a very good performance in terms of realizing the development goals, but then the underutilization of the input of individuals, of marginalized groups, doesn't come above the surface. So the general statistics may be all right, but the precise effect, the precise outcome for groups in society may not be all right. So what we are saying, when we are now preparing for post-development sustainable development goals post-2015, try to avoid that you make that same type of mistake. So don't talk too much about averages, about general mathematic outcomes you want to realize, without paying specific attention to the utilization of and the input of specific groups in society. And this brings me then to your third and final, somewhat provocative question, namely why paying attention to marginalized groups and not just paying attention to median voters and the average citizen, as if there would be a contradiction between the two. It's clear now to everyone in every society that inequality and the underutilization of certain groups in society is bad for economic growth as well. So there's no contradiction between approaching the median voters and using the potential of marginalized groups, because if a society is unfair, and of course a lot can be said about what's fair and what's not fair, but if there is a lot of inequality in a society, if large groups in a society or in a region cannot participate on their own merits, economic development pays a price for it. So there's a moral intrinsic value in including everybody in society in economic and social development, but also in economic arguments. And I think it's important for each and every country to understand that this is not only of importance for developing countries, but also the developed world. Mm-hmm. And countries in the developed world would be well advised to pay more attention to that. And our proposal is to make this specifically visible in the way the post-2015 development goals are going to be composed.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Campbell, maybe I can turn to you. We've got a moral argument and an economic argument. Do we also have a political argument here? I think one of the things that's really striking about Canada is that you've always been cited as this example of a country with tremendous social mobility, and where this notion of a shared society appears to be something that is common to all political parties, maybe with differences of degree. But is something that has been part of Canadian society for a long time. I mean, how do you make sure that this agenda is actually an agenda that is shared by all political groups? Because, we're talking about 2015 to 2030, there are going to be changes in political parties. And then perhaps what are the instruments that can be used? Some of the things you talk about in the paper. Disaggregated data, communications, consultation with groups, etc. Are those the things that in your mind have proven to be the most relevant tools for achieving this in Canada?
Well, I think first of all, Homie, that the commitment to shared societies is in many ways a mentality. And I think of the title of Santiago's book, Good Intentions, Bad Outcomes, is probably the most feared epitaph that any politician could have. And I think one of the things that we think about is how can we avoid doing the wrong things for the right reasons. And one of the ways of avoiding that is to try to get rid of the hubris that we know the answers to questions and understand that we don't know all the answers. And I'll give you some examples. In Canada, we have had for a very long time in the Government of Canada an Office of the Status of Women, whose job it is to do a kind of gender analysis of policy. And as a cabinet minister, I remember when I was Minister of Justice, talking to my colleague, the minister responsible for the status of women, and we were talking about some area, and I said, I didn't really see a gender aspect to that area of policy. She said, well, actually, you're quite mistaken. So here was I, a kind of, frothing at the mouth, well, maybe foaming at the mouth, but certainly a very ardent feminist, having to acknowledge that I had totally missed the gender implications of a certain area of policy making. And what is important to understand is that people, when we talk about shared societies, we're not just talking about minorities or marginalized groups. A majority can be marginalized for certain policy purposes. The Club of Madrid has done a lot of work with women in peace and security, and we have a particular project in the Horn of Africa. And one of our participants, I remember in the first mission, 2009, a woman from Uganda said, I was talking to our foreign minister, and he said, but what do women have to do with peace and security? And she said, and then I explained it to him, and he went, oh. And I think what we need are a lot of oh moments where we come to understand that what we think we're doing is having a differential effect on certain groups. And how can we identify those groups? What are the tools that we can use to make sure that we are not having bad outcomes because our policy is not well designed? And so the term shared societies has perhaps a kind of a new age sound to it in a way, you know, sharing and caring, and it's a little bit Sesame Street. But the reason for it is because it's a two-way street. It's this notion of giving people not just the opportunity to participate, but a sense of dignity, that we share a society, we share responsibilities, we share the need to try and understand how we're doing things. But the ultimate result is meant to be efficacy, effectiveness. It's meant to be policies that actually work, policies that don't waste money. You know, all of us, I mean, the United States, Canada, countries that are very involved in international development, you know, are voters, our citizens want to know that money is well spent. But even in our own societies, we don't want to waste money. I think of the, you know, the challenges that you know, American governments have faced in, you know, reforming of welfare law, et cetera. You know, people want to hold governments to account. But one of the best ways of doing this is not simply to identify the disproportional impact, but also to engage in conversations with people to find out how you can make things work. One of the things that was a leitmotif of my own operation in government was to get out and consult with people who were not the usual suspects, people who were affected by policy, and to find out what might really work for them. You know, there's nothing radical or subversive about the notion that the reality of the way people live should be one of the premises on which you make public policy. And so what we're really talking about is creating a mindset. And when we're looking at the Millennium Development Goals, they were really wonderful. And I don't think anybody would say that they haven't had an impact. But how could they have been better? How could we make them worse? What's the next step from 2015 on to try and create a reality, to try and have the desired outcomes, not bad outcomes, from the policy in which we're devoting a whole lot of time to developing. So I think of shared societies as techniques, just, and disaggregating data is one of them. And sometimes we're surprised by the results. We go, oh, we didn't think that was happening. But it's a mindset. It's a way of saying, if we really want things to work, we have to understand that life and societies are very complex, and that sometimes people are left out, either politically or socially or economically. And that sometimes majorities can be marginalized for certain purposes. Sometimes people can be marginalized geographically. There are all sorts of different ways. But if we ask those questions and don't feel that we have to a priori know the answers, to actually see them as questions that need to be pursued, we'll do a lot better job of all of our investment on economic development, of empowering people and getting the results. So it's a way of thinking, not just a series of techniques.
Thank you. So, you know, Mr. Utim, I mean, a way of thinking, sharing, it's all very well in very rich countries. They've got plenty of resources to share. Your country, Mauritius, has, you know, got some of the best social indicators, you know, across the world. And I think it's been from a very sharp focus on just trying to, you know, trying to make sure that you've got growth and development. So is there at all a tension between growth and development and the poverty alleviation agenda versus the shared societies perspective? Or do you see these as being very much the same thing in practice in your country?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the nice words that you've been saying about my country, about Mauritius. But we shouldn't go with the delusion that everything is rosy in my country. Of course, we've made a lot of progress, and unfortunately, I wouldn't, in 3 or 5 minutes, give you an exact indication of how we went about reaching or achieving what we've been able to achieve, because it has to go back to history. Our country is a relatively new country, but we had an advantage that our country was a desert island 400 years ago. Mm-hmm. There was no inhabitants of Mauritius. We are all migrants. All our ancestors came either from Europe, from Africa, or from Asia. From Europe, France, England; from Africa, Mozambique, Guinea, Senegal, Madagascar; from Asia, India, all the different states of India, and China. So you can have an idea of how not only heterogeneous is the Mauritian society, but how complex such a society can be. And yet, as you say, we have achieved what we have achieved. There is a long way to go, to reach the standards of people living in the West. But we can, with a certain measure of satisfaction, say that we have been able to reach where we have reached, thanks in particular to the vision of our leaders who led the country to independence in 1968. Thanks to the shared society vision, as if we had the shared society vision before the shared society existed as a concept in our Club de Madrid. We realized, our leaders realized, at the time of our independence in 1968, that we had a divided country. Half of the population voted in favor of, and half of the population, almost half, voted against the independence of Mauritius. You wouldn't believe it, that nearly 50% of a population of a country voting against the independence of of their own countries. Unbelievable, but incredible. But this was a fact. So the leaders of the day, in particular the Prime Minister of the day, the first Prime Minister of Mauritius, Sir Siusaga Ramgoolam, he had the wisdom of immediately after election asking the opposition to join government. Why don't you join in and we'll work together for the progress of Mauritius? There was a lot of problems in between, of course. Partisans on one side who had just been fighting a hard and tough battle on the ground refused. Most of the grassroots workers refused. But the wisdom of the leader prevailed, and there was a coalition government formed. And this brought slowly unity among the people. Not 100% unity, of course, but unity in a large measure. Consensus was reached. And gradually, it was this government, this first coalition government, that set the scene for the development of Mauritius. A second area in the political field itself, which brought in this shared society in Mauritius, was that the Constitution made room for proper representation of all the different communities in Parliament. A system was devised, an electoral system was devised, whereby all the different communities at the end of an election would find themselves represented in Parliament through what is known as the best loser system. It was not 100% representative, of all communities in Mauritius, not in an exact quota system based on the strength of each community, but it ensured an adequate representation of all the different communities on the island. So it slowly brings in unity. And a third area is the area of education. Education in Mauritius is free, from primary to university through secondary. Education is free. But what do we teach in our schools? I take the example of the languages. I have told you how complex is our society. People coming from different regions of the world, with their culture, with their religion, with their ethnic groups, with their language. And each one wants his language to prevail. Each one wants his children to learn the language of their ancestral language. So our education system provides for not only the compulsory teaching and learning of English and French, these are the two compulsory basic languages, but also the teaching of 13 other languages, starting from the primary schools. Not that all children, of course, will have to learn the 13 languages, but a child of Chinese origin, for example, would be able to learn Mandarin if he wanted to, if his parents wanted to, in the school. So teachers were provided so that all the different provincial languages from India, or Europe, or China would be taught to our children. In that way, the languages of all the different communities are respected. This is another way of going about to bring unity and ensuring ultimately the progress of the country. We are a secular state, and we believe that secularism for a country like Mauritius would be the best answer to bring unity and also to bring about development. But we are a secular state with a difference. Religion plays a very important role in Mauritius. All the different communities are very religious. I'm not saying spiritually. Very religious. Number of churches, a number of temples, a number of mosques. People go to churches, and churches are not closed as they are in other places. Churches are very well attended, not only on Sundays. So what type of secular state do we have? We have a secular state where the state provides subsidy to all religious groups. In the past, in the colonial days, under British colonization, the Church of England religion was being funded by the state. So we couldn't stop. The leaders of the day didn't feel that we should stop this subsidy, this funding of the Anglican Church. So the answer to that was, let us give to all the different religions an annual subsidy based on the per capita. You have 300,000 Catholics. This is what the state will contribute at the end of the for a year. You have 700,000 people. This is how much you would. So in so doing, the state, while remaining a secular state, is helping the different religions because we believe that moral values play an important part in our society. So this is how.
Thank you.
There's a long list that we can go through. This is how we have been able to put into practice the concept of shared society that has ensured, we believe, partly the progress.
So coalitions, subsidies, and programs that really extend across everybody without discriminating across them. Mr. Levy, Latin America. Latin America probably is, the region with the highest levels of inequality in the world. Some of the biggest issues with, different groups. They've done very well by some measures on reducing poverty, much less well in really achieving sustained growth or in dealing with these issues of shared societies or inclusive growth. And in many ways, your book was really about highlighting some of those tensions. How do you resolve that? And
So thank you, Homi. And yes, sadly, Latin America stands out as being the most unequal region in the world. Actually, 14 of the 15 most unequal countries in the world are in Latin America, so not something to be proud of. The region has made quite a bit of progress in reducing extreme poverty in terms of ensuring that the poorest 10 or 15 or 20% of the population in each of these countries now has much better indicators of consumption and access to health. But the region has a long way to go in terms of reducing inequality and a much even longer way to go in constructing shared societies. There's a big difference between lowering your indices of extreme poverty and having shared societies in terms of real inclusion in terms of people. And what I've been trying to highlight in my book is that the structure in which social programs are currently carried out in Latin America is not conducive to a shared society if you think about a shared society in terms of including everybody with the same set of standards of rights and obligations, particularly vis-a-vis the labor market. What is true about the region is that depending on which country you look at, 50%, 60%, 80% of the labor force finds itself in informal jobs. And only 30, 40% of the population of the workers have access to health and pensions through a formal job. The structure of programs that is currently being put together to solve this problem is not conducive to inclusive growth and is actually having perverse incentives and perverse results because it is actually making the informal sector bigger and is giving prices for being in the informal sector to the extent that formal people have to pay for a set of benefits, informal people are getting benefits for free. Very different from Canada, where you have universal health insurance, very different from European countries. So the details of the program, the structure of taxation, and the structure of program design is central to achieving shared prosperity. This is a very important point. People applaud after any social program, and they think that any social program is to the good. The point that I'm trying to make is that not any program will be to the good, and that you have to think carefully about the incentives and the message that you give in terms of rights and obligations. And the region, Latin America, although has made great progress in the last decade in reducing extreme poverty, is not really having the architecture of social programs that will lead to a more shared society and a more inclusive society. And what's important is to raise consciousness that the potential of individuals is being wasted, their contribution to society is being wasted, what they could be as productive individuals is not being achieved, and that in fact everybody is losing in a context in which we're trying to reach more inclusion through the wrong set of programs and institutions. So big challenge ahead, even though some progress made so far.
Thank you. So Mr. Podesta, let's bring this back to the post-2015 agenda and the panel report that you produced. Came up with this principle, leave no one behind. Do you want to say a few words about, first, how did the panel come to that conclusion, and what do you think will actually change on the ground if people decided to adopt that principle?
Yeah, I'll come at this, and I'm coming at it from perhaps the, I meet Mr. Levy in the center, but I'm coming at it from the other perspective. First of all, thank you, Homi. Homi was the secretary of the high-level panel, as I think all of you know, and did a brilliant job of herding a lot of very diverse cats into a consensus position. And I think with our three co-chairs, let me start there, I think we began with trying to decide what the mission of this panel, having been charged by the Secretary General to consider how we move forward in the post-2015 environment. I remember in the first meeting, the Secretary General said we have to keep our head in the clouds but our feet on the ground. And our chairs pushed us to adopt a mission. And I think from the very first meetings that we had, I think saw and came together as a group, again, quite a diverse group, of that ending extreme poverty was both aspirational, that it could grab the mind space, the attention, and the commitment globally, but it was also operational. That we, excuse me, I'm Italian American. I'm trying to use. I can't speak even without using my hands, so I apologize for the for the bandage. But when I say it was operational, I think we tried to take the lessons from the MDGs that Wim Kok discussed. And we came up with, and I'll just read two sentences from our mission that we adopted early, which was our vision and our responsibility is to end extreme poverty in all its forms in the context of sustainable development and to have in place the building blocks of sustained prosperity for all. The gains in poverty eradication should be irreversible. So if you start from that perspective, that was a challenge to the world that we could actually achieve and make operational, then I think you have to quickly move to the idea that you could leave no one behind, that you had to reach a perspective that was that reached into marginalized societies if your goal was to and extreme poverty. And we had to get that right this time around. We saw the gains that had occurred as a result, I think, of the MDGs and the concentration and bringing together governments, international institutions, and global philanthropy around a simple set of goals, and the fact that they could move both analysis, move money, move commitment towards achieving goals, but that in order to get the whole way to really end extreme poverty, we had to begin with that frame of leaving no one behind. So what did that mean in practice? I think that when I think it guided our analysis and guided particularly the illustrative goals and indicators that are included in the report. So in practice, it means would a woman be able to inherit property or open a bank account? It meant that wherever you were born in the world, that you had a right to legal identity, registration at birth. It means that I think, and Kim Campbell already mentioned this, that you could not only track global growth trends and averages about lifting people out of poverty, you really had to look at the lowest quintile of population. And that's why I think the call in the report for a data revolution and specifically looking at indicators and trying to break them out and say which ones needed to be disaggregated, which were the most important to understand whether societies were reaching their most marginalized citizens was really quite central, I think, to the path forward for the global development agenda. And I think more broadly, and I speak for myself in this context, I think it meant that in order to reach people at the margins, particularly the most extreme poor, it meant that you had to better connect the poor to the economic, the social, and the political lives of their countries. And that you couldn't just rely on strong growth models, strong GDP growth in societies in order to achieve that measure. We've seen substantial poverty alleviation that has come from strong growth, but in order to be sustainable and shared growth, inclusive growth, you had to be conscious of the fact that you had to reach the most marginalized people in society. So that this concept of inclusive growth has to be connected, and people, the poorest people in the world, have to be connected to ladders of opportunity. That means connection to the financial system, connection to the education system, connection to the healthcare systems of their countries. So I think in the end of the day, whether we got it exactly right, that will be left to the future. I'm sure we didn't, and there's much to add to it. But I think the analytic context was that strong, sustainable growth could only come if you connected everyone to a shared prosperity model. And so let me close by saying that I think I very much welcome the report by the Club of Madrid. I think it adds texture and context to the work that we did on the panel.
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, we've talked now very much about how this operates within a country. But in the Club of Madrid report, there's also a sense that this concept is actually more applicable globally as well, and that we should think about it in terms of our international relations and things like that. And in that context, and Mr. Uti, maybe I can call on you here. You know, the African Union was developing a post-2015 position, and that's very much about economic transformation. And so I wonder whether you can say something about to what extent is this agenda of economic transformation, which seems to be at the heart of how the African countries see the post-2015 agenda, really relates to a slightly different concept, which is shared societies.
I will start by saying that probably we shouldn't pose the problem in terms of a dichotomy between economic transformation and inclusive growth. This is what the Club of Madrid stands for: inclusive growth. And this is there is no dichotomy between this and the economic transformation that African Union, for instance, position that the African Union, for instance, is taking. The Africa, a common position on economic transformation and inclusive growth, brings the two ideas together. If we approach them in the right way, I think economic transformation is the means to inclusive growth, and inclusive growth is the requirement for economic transformation. It is not that we do different things, but we do things differently, bearing in mind how policy in one field has an impact on policy in another field, and so adjust policies to avoid those unintended consequences. In the Shared Societies project, and generally in the Club de Madrid, we talk about a virtuous or benign circle, which happens when we work in this holistic manner. In the Shared Societies project, we have set down 10 areas of policy which states need to commit to. We call them the 10 commitments, not commandments, the 10 commitments. What are those 10 commitments? I have noted it down, and I'll read them to you. First commitment: locate responsibility for social cohesion within government structures. Number 2, create opportunities for minorities to be consulted. Number 3, monitor structures and policies to ensure they are supportive of social cohesion. Number 4, ensure the legal framework protects the rights of the individual. 5, deal with economic disadvantage and discrimination. 6, ensure the physical environment creates opportunities for social interaction. 7, create an education system that demonstrates a commitment to a shared society. 8, encourage the creation of a shared vision for society. 9, promote respect, understanding, and appreciation of diversity. 10, reduce tension and hostility between communities. If these commitments are taken by the states and respected, we believe that it will be able to create everywhere in the world shared societies. And shared societies, we contend, is the best way of one of the best ways of going about to reduce the problem of extreme poverty in the world.
But Ms. Gamble, here are 10 commitments. These are not the same as 10 or however many sustainable development goals that you expect the world to adopt, right? So how do you link these with the post-2015 agenda, and what's been the response? You've been going around the world talking to world leaders about these commitments. How do you think it's going?
Well, if we think of the Millennium Development Goals as the what, the 10 commitments are almost the how, because it says it matters how you do things. And it's interesting. It's such a big subject, but just a couple of things. I said before that it was a mindset, but John Podesta talked about being an Italian American and why he needs to wave his hands around. If you go to the museum at Ellis Island, there are wonderful posters, posters about American immigration in the late 19th century, and posters talking about to beware I forget. There's a word that means inferior or whatever, South European type, This is the South European type, is a pillar of American society. But if we go back and we look at Canada and the United States, which are very inclusive societies in many ways, they weren't always like that. And we had terrible prejudice, and people came, and they didn't look and they didn't sound like the people who were already there. And how did they make their way up to become the Podestas and the Panettas and all of the people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and all of the places that people thought of as being inferior? How did they make their way up? Well, they do this through commitments of government, structures of law. You create structures of law, you create protection, then people have to fight to use them. In Canada, we actually were late to a constitutionally entrenched Bill of Rights, which came in 1983. We had civil rights before that, but that actually created a whole new flourishing of challenges to the legal frameworks that enabled people to participate fully, and our Aboriginal rights were constitutionalized. And what I'm saying is it's a way of thinking and a way of creating the basis on which commitments by government that give people the tools to use. Because there was some very interesting research published recently in the United States, and I can't remember the exact title, but that showed that rich people actually think they're superior. Now that's very dangerous. It's this kind of reifying way. And here we are, we're rich, we're better than other people. And yet what we know is that throughout the world, when people who have been marginalized, whether it's women not allowed to participate in the economy, whether it's certain ethnic groups, whether it's people of certain religions or people of certain disabilities, when they are given a chance, when they are given the opportunity to share in the opportunities of society, it's a revelation to us. They turn out to be really smart and really productive and to really be very, very important. And when we look at the contributions, I mean, Canada and the United States are so lucky that we have had these waves of immigrants who come in and energize our society with their dedication and their skills and their different ways of looking. You know, and you have a society like Mauritius, which in many ways, I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity to be an entrepreneur because you've got this incredibly multilingual population. In Canada, we have 2 official languages, but we also encourage people to keep their heritage languages. So you start out with these government commitments, the legislative frameworks, the policy. It doesn't happen overnight. Canadians are not different people from people anywhere else. We have all the same flaws. But you create the structures that enable people to use those levers to get a leg up and to have a part. And we are living examples of the fact that notwithstanding the prejudice, the ability of people to, the condescension that people have, that everybody, that intelligence is no respecter of class or race or background. And what we see in many parts of the world is that we sort of think, oh, these people, you know, they've never been democratic, or they've always been poor, or they'll never get there. And yet, really, what they are is a whole great body of unrealized potential. And so for the Millennium Development Goals, we need to take the next step and say, we've defined these wonderful goals. How do we help countries actually get there? And have we been missing the point in terms of the how? And I think that's what shared societies is all about.
But migration has been one of the toughest issues to make any progress on globally. And, you know, Mr. Levy, I mean, migration is a huge issue in Latin America. And do you see any prospect that in this post-2015 agenda, we're really going to get, you know, a strong commitment to more open migration and not just of the, you know, of highly skilled workers, but all the way for everybody?
I'd be rather agnostic about that. My sense is that an inheritance of the 2008-2009 crisis, both in the United States and Europe, are such weak labor markets that governments are going to be quite reticent for quite a few years to be much more generous in terms of migration. I don't think that we can make big bets on that. And I think for most of the inclusive agenda that Latin America has to be done, it really realistically has to be thought of as by the governments of those countries and by the societies of those countries, and no longer rely on help from abroad or trying to have their problems solved through migration to other countries.
So what about domestic migration? Because that's another part of migration. And you know, there are also issues in Latin America about domestic migration, how that's done, and discrimination.
But those issues are more associated with specific ethnic groups or Afro-American descendants or Indo-American descendants that are still very much marginalized along the lines of what Prime Minister Koch was saying at the beginning. And even though there's been great progress in reducing extreme poverty, if you disaggregate the data a little bit more and you look at subsect of people, it's not been as homogeneous reduction. And yes, there is some room for that. But that, again, would be an internal agenda to the countries as opposed to thinking of it as a global issue. Not that we wouldn't want to,
Right.
but we just think it's not in the cards for the next decade.
So, Mr. Podesta, let me just come back to you and put this in the context of there are lots of countries around the world where groups are not particularly sharing and interacting harmoniously with each other. I mean, we have conflict in so many different places, and we've got this notion that somehow a peace dividend through some kind of a shared society vision would help with peace. But do we have actually good examples of how that kind of, sharing can actually help in situations of conflict, or is this just a hope that we still have?
Well, it seems to me that if you think about peace being, it's a difficult issue, particularly in the UN context and post-2015 context. We, I think, experienced that on the panel. It's not. It is clear, I guess, that conflict can drive poverty. If you look at the changing face of where really poor people live, it's quite different just in one generation. From when a generation ago, 80% of extremely poor people lived in low-income, stable countries. Now 50% live in middle-income countries, but 40% live in conflict-affected countries. So again, if our aim is to kind of reach all and try to end extreme poverty, I think tackling this question of conflict and post-conflict is important. I don't know that the development agenda is likely to have a major impact on conflict mediation, if you will. I mean, you think of Syria or South Sudan or Central African Republic, and it's unlikely that that the application of a development set of goals or strategies is gonna effectuate much in the way of conflict resolution. On the other hand, I think we have to pay much more attention to kind of post-conflict situations and think about how we do a better job of creating the mechanisms of development and the mechanisms of social inclusion that will produce more stability going forward. And, kind of in that context, I think the work of the G7 Plus is important, trying to build. Our report focused on institution building, more transparency, building access to justice. And I think that those are mechanisms that produce more inclusive societies and more shared prosperity. But I think they also deal with direction in post-conflict states. And I'll say one last thing, which is I think one of the things that's been quite vexing in recent years in a post-conflict context is goes back to the question you asked about, is economic transformation and inclusive growth, are those two different kind of conceptualizations? But if you're thinking about the means of economic transformation, including private sector investment and building out the capacity of people to have livelihoods, then I think we have to do a better job of thinking about how we're going to manage investment particularly into post-conflict states, which has been, I think, a very difficult situation and context, and how international financial institutions and private sector donors in particular think about how we get more private sector flows going into post-conflict situations can, I think, be effective in making the turn so that those states don't end up in permanent cycles of violence. And, I think there are some good examples of that. We've seen that perhaps in Liberia and in Timor in East Timor, in Colombia. I would argue. I don't know if Mr. Levy agrees with me about that.
So you brought up international financial institutions, and there's, we have this whole set of institutions, in some sense, that governs the world. Mr. Koch, I mean, it seems as if multilateral governance isn't really going anywhere. I mean, trade talks are stalled, and climate talks are stalled, and there's not all that much increases in aid any longer. They're flat, even maybe declining in some fragile states. I mean, do you really have hope that actually we're moving to a world which adopts this idea of shared societies as a global concept as well as within each individual country?
Yeah, that's a very broad question. I think at the moment, we have the paradoxical situation that in a world that is more interdependent than ever before, we turn various parts of the world and individual countries, even the largest ones and the biggest ones, turn into the direction of being more inward-looking than we would like to see it. And, the current situation illustrates that we are still far from an ideal type of multilateralism you are referring to. But I think there are signs of hope. Listening to what you said in that report, leaving no one behind. You can be cynical and say, well, these are just words. I'm not cynical. I don't want to be cynical. So leave no one behind means that we have the challenge to translate that mission into instruments, also being part of new development goals, where you can measure and monitor how developments are. Kind of hope is, listen to the State of the Union. Inequality is a major concern for the United States. Inequality is a major concern also for other states in the world. And this is, of course, not very promising, but the promise is that if we find this a pain in our ass, we have to find way and means in order to tackle the problem. Look at China. The Chinese government, the Chinese authorities are deeply concerned about the lack of social cohesion, about the growing social problems. So there is a growing awareness all over the globe that growth, of course, is very important, but growth is not the only thing that counts. Just GDP doesn't tell us that much. Quality of growth, here we come to the environmental challenge, of course, but also the way, the question about who profits, who takes the advantage, who takes the benefits of economic growth, social mobility. So there are strong reasons for think tanks, but also politicians, and other organizations in various countries all over the world to think in depth about this challenge. And I notice, I may be too optimistic now, but I noticed that in the international financial institutions, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, there's also a growing awareness. So I think we are still living in a time where we sometimes say that the crisis is over. Well, I hesitate if the crisis is really over, because we are still in the aftermath and a lot still can happen. So You see the immediate turmoil in developing markets as soon as tapering, quantitative easing starts. We in Europe are by far not yet out of the woods. I mean, the most serious situation around the Eurozone is behind us, but we're still not yet out of the woods. Reforms are absolutely necessary in a number of countries. So it's volatile. And in this climate of volatility, don't expect all of a sudden a new wave of enthusiasm. But I think there's a growing concern, a growing awareness that not only at the local, at the domestic, at the regional level, but also at the global level, some kind of shared society thinking is needed, because we start to understand better that in the end we will all benefit from positive developments in terms of shared societies, also in developing countries elsewhere in the world.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let me start to open it up to the floor for questions. You'll see that this notion of shared societies, you know, it touches on so many different issues. I mean, we've talked about global governance, about conflict, education, migration, mindsets and culture, just lots of things. So the floor is open. Please introduce yourself. A microphone will come round. And if you have a question for a specific panel member, please indicate who. Yes, so we have a lady here, a gentleman, and then a gentleman there.
Good morning. Thank you all for your comments. My name is Wendy, and I'm with the American Red Cross. And we're one of 189 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies throughout the world. And we know that natural disasters, shocks, everyday stresses, something we share as a society is our vulnerability to those. And unfortunately, the most poor and marginalized people get trapped in a cycle of poverty. Now, we hear this word resilience a lot. Is that the same as a shared society to you? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a...
Brian Atwood, Brookings non-resident fellow in the University of Minnesota. I want to first thank the Club of Madrid for the statement it's made. This is not the first time the Club of Madrid has come forward on development issues. Your support for the effectiveness agenda that was taken up in Busan, Korea was very important as well. I want to ask perhaps John Podesta and Homi from the high-level panel. It seems to me that in the debate, especially in New York, with respect to the G77 of the poorest countries of the world, they're most concerned about MDG 8 not being implemented, basically policy coherence for development. This means, and maybe the political leaders here could also get into this as well, and it may relate to the answer that Mr. Levy gave on migration. Especially when you're having economic problems, making concessions on issues related to finance and trade are much more difficult. But they may be the answers. At least you can end the contradictions between what you're trying to do with official development assistance and what you're trying to do with policy related to trade and the like. How did you address that on the high-level panel, and how can we address those issues politically nowadays?
Yeah. There's one...
My name is Ed Melkert. I had the honor to serve under Prime Minister Kok as Minister of Social Affairs and Employment in the Netherlands. I want to talk about labor market. Santiago Levy has referred to it. The single unique feature of the MDGs is really the monitoring, having indicators that show whether you're on the right track or not. In 2000, there's been a big fight about having employment as one of the key indicators. And the fight was lost for all kinds of reasons, including the coherence and the interaction with the international financial institutions. Now that fight is on the agenda again. And following the ideas that are related to shared society. And not only looking at the marginalized, but also at the problems of the aspiring middle class that came up but fell down in the years of crisis. Aren't the labor market indicators, shouldn't the labor market indicators not be the innovation really in the next stage of the MDGs, both the employment, social security, pension, but then also the share of laborers in the formal economy? Because that is, of course, the issue that is often hidden behind all the figures that people are simply not counted for. So my question would be whether that would be supported and whether the Club of Madrid would not take the lead in that. Be very happy to see that.
Okay, why don't we quickly deal with those? Santiago, do you want to take up this issue of labor markets?
Perhaps I can take the third question. So that's music to my ears. I certainly think that, again, from Latin America's perspective, I can't speak for other regions of the world that I don't know well, but if I think about Latin America and I think about the development challenges ahead, not that the issue of extreme poverty has been fully solved, but we're way on our way to solving it, and we sort of understand what needs to be done. The greatest challenge is access to a good job, access to a formal job, access to a job that has associated with it insurance in terms of health, pensions, disability, that will protect you against shocks and the middle classes from this going up and down. And certainly having indicators of insertion in the labor market, the share of the population that is the formal labor market, who has access to jobs, men, women, the young, the old, by race and all that, will certainly be, in my view, probably the sine qua non of the indicators that we would like to follow to ensure that we can construct a shared prosperity on a productive basis. And so I couldn't agree more with your proposal.
Thank you. Mr. Podesta, would you like to take up the issue of MDG 8?
You know, I'd like to take the first and the second question and link them to some extent. The term climate change hasn't come up in our discussion all morning, and I think that's probably a mistake. I think that, and the approach of the panel actually, I think, aimed at trying to build sustainability and finance. I think with respect to, we came up with a goal of creating a global enabling environment and catalyzing long-term finance, to Brian's point. But what we largely did, I think, it may be a disappointing part of the report as I reflect on it, is we dragged in a lot of other conversations. Dragged in the 2 degrees C limit. We dragged in a development-friendly trade regime, which is sort of, you know, more or less stuck in the global trade dialogues. I think we were focused on finance in a context in which there is, and it comes back to the first question, in a context in which there's a tremendous need for finance to build resilient societies that will keep people from the shocks that are certain to come, I would say, not likely to come, are certain to come from a changing global environment. And in the context of the global climate negotiations, in Copenhagen, there was an agreement to try to mobilize $100 billion a year of climate finance. Well, how is that going to be done at a time when there's so many needs on the development agenda? And will there be an ability of the global system to kind of make those two streams come together? In my view, that's a very tricky part of what's going to of the negotiations that will go forward in the post-2015 context. How do you mesh the challenges and the needs to build sustainability and resilience from the shocks of global climate change at a time where you're trying to lift people up? And I think in some ways those things have to come together. I mean, conceptually. We have to be able to be able to bring together economic strategies and development strategies that are going to take account of both lifting people out of poverty, connecting them to sustainable economies. But we have to do it, I think, in the context of being cognizant of both sides of that. That is largely, I think, going to come from mobilization of private capital, as opposed to being stuck in the I think where development assistance is going to be most needed is creating the mechanisms to draw private capital into building the infrastructure of more resilient societies, which tackles both, I think, the climate challenge and the ability to provide a kind of a social floor for people who will be who have caused the least amount of the problem of climate change, but will be affected the most by it.
Thank you. Let me just read out a couple of questions that have come by Twitter, and let me just remind people, hashtag shared societies, if you're using that. How are people with disabilities and young people included in the vision for shared societies? And another question, how do we build accountability for the shared society vision? Any of the panel members like to take up those?
I think, again, it goes back to this point I made at the beginning, that very often we don't see who the marginalized, excluded people are, and we need to be open to the notion that there are people who are being left out that could make a contribution. Certainly in my own country, the laws protecting people with disabilities that are actually entrenched in our Constitution have been the foundation on which policy has opened up doors for people to make the contribution. I mean, the city of Vancouver, where I'm from, had a mayor who is in fact a quadriplegic, Sam Sullivan. Now, for much of my life, you would have looked at Sam Sullivan and said, very nice, and let's hope we can find a job for somebody with such a disability. But the notion of leading a major city and getting out and fighting, duking it out in the political arena would not have struck you. So I think what we need to do is to, as I say, open up our minds to that. The same thing with young people. I just saw a comment the other day, I forget what country it was that experimented, but giving the votes to people at 16 didn't appear to have dramatically changed their society, or you're taking it to hell in a handbasket. You know, maybe there are ways in which we need to empower younger people, because they're not, 16-year-olds today are not the 16-year-olds, even when I was 16. Hate to say it, but certainly the 16-year-olds of my parents' generation. So these are the kinds of things that if you have the attitude and the kind of mindset of a shared society, that's it. And I would just also go back to point out with respect to that first question about resilience, because it really does, if you look at the United States and the response to natural disasters, in New York, Hurricane Sandy, or in Canada, the flooding in Calgary, things like that, countries that have capacity in their government, that have the capacity, both in terms of local and regional governments, that have, first responders, have people who know how to take decisions, where people are literate, where they can follow instructions, they can read. I mean, it's a whole different order of magnitude of the ability to respond. And when we talk about climate change, there's a kind of a trifecta of disadvantaged countries. The ones that are most vulnerable to climate change are the poorest, and the ones who are the weakest or failing states. What the Club of Madrid is about is really about democracy, and because we see it as the way of building capacity, but it has to be done by the way of bringing in all of these resources that countries often overlook. And so I think it's all kind of seamless. But again, if we're looking at how we move in the next step of alleviating poverty, et cetera, and I think this idea, leave no one behind, is really another way of talking about a shared society. Don't assume that certain groups of people can't make a contribution, can't be part of the solution to our problems. Because if we don't include them, we will always be kind of just halfway there in finding the answers. So young people, disabled people, people who are, as I say, and often majority people, where it might be an ethnic group or women or whatever, are often marginalized for certain purposes in societies. Societies that are run by elites, that just assume that whole groups of people don't really have anything to offer. And it's a tragedy for all of us, even if it's not happening in our own country.
Okay, thank you. So let me come back to the floor. I'd seen plenty of more hands. Let's start right in front.
Yes, thank you. Jim Michael, I'm a consultant and a student, I guess. It seems to me that this is a wonderful opportunity because we have panelists who are not only thinkers about development and the future of our societies and the benefits of inclusion and inclusive societies, and at the same time, people who have great political insights and who have been in positions of great responsibility for managing the tension between things that seem like obvious good policy and political contests in which people oppose those views. Santiago Levy's reference to migration, I think, is an excellent example where there's a lot of evidence on the benefits of more open migration and at the same time a lot of political resistance to it. And I wonder if the panelists with their political insights might have some thoughts about the political challenges and dealing with those political challenges to more advancing more inclusive societies as a part of the development agenda for post-2015. Thank you.
Thank you. Right in front, this silver-haired gentleman.
Thank you very much. Colin Bradford from Brookings as well.
Stand, please.
Okay. It's very inspiring. Thanks to each of you for this morning. This has been, I hope this will be broadly disseminated. The most discouraging moment, however, was Santiago Levy's saying that well-intended programs don't produce results because of what I understood to be what I would call the structural context in which they're being carried out. So the question I'd like to ask for all of you is, how would you be more specific about what those structural elements are which keep good programs and good policies from having real effect? The two that occur to me, which none of you have mentioned so far, is the tax system and the financial system. But I leave it to you to identify what you think they are. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a lady right behind.
Hi, my name is Janie. I'm a sophomore at American University. And my question is, it seems like in any level, whether it's domestic or regional or international, we can't address these issues of minorities or the marginalized effectively without the engagement of external groups that don't particularly believe that they're part of the issue. So it was mentioned that dialogue was key to encourage groups to embrace their role in affecting shared society. So whether it's groups of polarized groups or even in the development field between groups that are overlooked and those implementing these development efforts, I was wondering, in this agenda of shared society, is there a commitment in different ways of facilitating these interchanges? Thank you.
Let me come back to the panel. I think this is going to be the last word. Mr. Koch, any of those questions? Political challenges, structural constraints, how you communicate with groups?
Yeah, let me focus on two of the questions. One is on political tensions. I think one striking example nowadays is how we deal with migration in Europe. You see there, on one hand, that large parts of the population, at least considerable parts of the population, tend to be suspicious or hostile against a free flow of migration, even within the European Union. I'm not yet talking about migration from outside the European Union, but inside the European Union. And there are a number of reasons for this, of course. The labor market situation nowadays, the not always unjustified fear that parts of the incomers from other East European economies, for example, are not always good for security and safety, because there are sometimes gangs of people who organize a lot of inconvenience, including criminality. But that's, of course, not the whole story. And on the other hand, you see that on the somewhat longer run, there's a growing need for migrating workers, because the labor market scarcities 10 years or 15 years from now will be huge. So that's one very good example of the tension, where politicians on one hand have to take the concerns and the suspicion of their population into account, of course. If they wouldn't, they would not be trusted any longer. On the other hand, people have to be forward-looking and say, especially politicians have to be forward-looking and say, well, how are we going to solve our medium and longer-term scarcity on the labor market problem without migration? Second phenomenon I want to mention is this was about the structures, the structures that are necessary for the future. Let's say the ongoing discussion in not only European but especially European countries on the future of the welfare state. Well, we have been, compared with other parts of the world, relatively generous in terms of organizing a social safety net in with all various elements. You know that. But reforming the social safety net, reforming the welfare schemes is extremely important, also in order to take into account the necessity to restore a balance between entitlements on one hand and responsibility on the other hand. That's also about shared society. Shared society is not just sharing in the benefits, in this case of welfare society, but also sharing in the responsibilities, where everyone has to make a contribution. And it's very important, I think, to approach this modernization, this ongoing process of modernizing and reviewing the welfare society system, and also not only from the point of view of austerity programs and we need to save money, but also in terms of responsibilities. And I think this is again an issue where politicians should not only listen to what their electorate is telling them, but also showing the way forward in order to explain to people that it's sometimes necessary to change a bit from a protective society into a participation society where everyone has to make a contribution, and then society also has the responsibility, of course, not only to ask people to contribute, but also to be active in organizing opportunities for people to be active in.
Thank you. Ms. Campbell, participation societies?
You know, it's interesting. I think one of the big challenges today, there seems to be a consensus that leadership ain't what it used to be, that there's somehow a deficit of leadership. And I'm not sure whether it is the leadership that has changed or the followership, or the context in which people are trying to lead. I think of my own time in government. The issue that brought me into national politics in Canada was the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which was the subject of an enormously contentious election in 1988 in Canada. And there's a lot of conventional wisdom that, a lot of people thought, Canada would get, totally overwhelmed by the United States, although there's much of evidence that shows that the smaller country in such an arrangement benefits more. But in fact, our party actually won the election, so we implemented the agreement, and most people now would say that that was a very good thing. We also brought in a goods and services tax, a multi-stage value-added tax, to replace a federal sales tax that was killing our exports, and Canada is very dependent on exports. That was probably one of the issues that helped to defeat us in '93, but the tax is still there because it was good policy. As Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, I implemented very comprehensive gun control legislation, and although we don't have anything even like the Second Amendment in Canada, it's a very divisive issue, probably more divisive in the criminal law area than abortion. Now, we were able to move ahead with these, and now I would say that I tried to maximize the constituency for good policy in the issues that I was responsible for, but also even in the free trade and the tax thing. But in a parliamentary system, if you have a majority government, Once you've tried to maximize the constituency for the policy, you can usually move ahead with it. And what that means is that even though you may make a lot of people mad in the short term, the policy has a chance to play itself out, and people may even defeat you in the next election. But interestingly enough, all of the policies, the parties that were strongly against us in these policies took them up on their own, and they have now become kind of conventional wisdom in Canada. They're no longer even seen as all that controversial, aggravating but not controversial in terms of the goods and services tax. So how do leaders take the responsibility to make decisions sometimes that are unpopular? Now, sometimes there are structural things that make it possible, like a parliamentary system when you have a majority government. And I think the American system may be more difficult that way. But I also think that there are things out there, the internet, which can be a wonderful source of information. It's also a source of so much stupidity and misinformation, you know, where you can have an opinion whether you've bothered to read anything or you know anything about it or not. And so it can, I think also, the instantaneous nature of the responses to things, I also think makes the context that's more difficult for politicians. But I think one of the great skills, I do believe that public service is a calling. And when we celebrated the 50th anniversary, or marked the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, as a child of that generation of the 60s, I said that President Kennedy made people feel that public service was a noble calling. And I still feel that way. But I think it's hard. And I think one of the challenges of politicians is they have to work with civil society. They have to work with partners to try and create the constituency for good policy. It won't always happen overnight. And you have to be prepared to lose an election on it, too. And a lot of people are not. But I think democratic politics is hard. Democracy is a blunt instrument. It's not a precision tool. But Churchill was right. It's the worst form of government except for all the others. And that's why we in the Club of Madrid are so committed to it. And so I think this challenge, we all have to ask ourselves, as leaders or former leaders or citizens or people in think tanks or academia, how do we help to create the constituency for good policy? How do we help to answer the kind of knee-jerk reactions? And how do we help to try and understand that sometimes there will be, for the best of intentions, bad outcomes, but that's in some ways unavoidable because we can't know everything. But how do we learn from why we had those bad outcomes to try and prevent them? And that's why, in a sense, when we talk about the shared societies, the Millennium Development Goals were an extraordinary step forward as a global consensus. How can we make them better? How can we add forms of accountability and monitoring to them and dimensions of thinking that will make them better? It won't be perfect. But leadership is hard today, and I think we have to understand that maybe there aren't going to be Lyndon Johnsons who can twist an arm or Franklin Roosevelts who can mobilize people. Maybe there will be, but we have to learn to take some of that responsibility on ourselves to create the constituency that enables the people who have the ultimate responsibility to pass the laws and legislation and policy that are the foundation for building these better things, to enable them to do that. And that's the challenge that modern democracies face.
Thank you. Mr. Rutin, just 1 minute.
1 minute? Well, perhaps I'll express my surprise. I'm the only voice from the South here. And I find it extraordinary how leaders from certain northern countries resolve their contradiction. I'm taking the example of migration, for instance. Migrants are welcome, are most welcome. This is a free movement of goods, free movements of services, free movements of people. But reach a certain time, when situation goes bad, no migration. Migration is not good. Migration of people should stop. Migration of goods should continue. Migration of people should stop. Right? This is not understandable. You have, I mean, this is not a critics against anybody in this room. This is only an observation that the Western world has to realize that if they want to get rid of people from the South, then the South must be given the opportunity of developing. Development should go to the South. In the 1950s and much before, everything that could be taken away from Africa, from Asia, has been taken away. Right? And now is the time not only to give back, but to help those people that have been colonized for so long to stand up on their own feet, to develop their country, This will prevent you. If the Western world had gone by what they have promised, that is the 0.07 or 0.7% of their GDP contribution to the third, so-called third world, today there wouldn't be so many migrants trying to come to the West, right? In Mauritius, in the 1950s and 1960s, shiploads of people were going to Belgium, to France, to England, trying to sneak in. But today, no one wants to come to because the country itself has developed. Why should they leave the sun? Why should they leave the sea and the good life in Mauritius? So my point of view is that if you want to solve the migration problem, right, you help the third world countries, the developing countries, into becoming sustainable, into going into sustainable development, creating jobs for the young people. There is no better way of solving poverty than to give a job. By giving a job, you are giving dignity at the same time to a young man. This young man, in our part of the world, will help the family. And like in other places, in the South, we still, fortunately, look after our parents so that if a young man is given a job, is able to earn a living, it's not a living for himself. It's a living for the whole family. So creation of a shared society, helping the people from countries from the South would be one of the best options for resolution of this migration problem.
Thank you, and I'm sure many of us would look forward to migrating to Mauritius, certainly in our old age. Mr. Levy, last word.
So quick comment on Colin's questions about architecture. In many Latin American countries, the children of formal workers and the children of informal workers can go to the same public schools, but they cannot go to the same public health clinics. The reason is that all schools are funded from general revenues, and therefore your labor status doesn't matter to what school you go to. But health services are not funded from general revenues. They're funded for formal workers from wage taxes. And therefore, the same children can go to the same schools, but not to the same clinics. Contrast that architecture of social structure programs with, say, Canada or with England, where the National Health Service will imply that regardless of your status, you can go to the safe health clinics when they're from the public sector. What's behind this, at the end of the day, is a taxation issue that you mentioned. That's where the chickens come home to roost. We talk a lot about sharing, but we don't talk about the taxation side. And unless we make the tax reforms that are required to have public health services, you're going to have this dichotomy, which really breaks at the heart of a shared society concept.
Thank you. Mr. Podesta, you have the last word.
Well, I think if you think about what we celebrate the success of the MDGs, there were places where it failed, but if you think about the success, what were the structural differences? And I would posit that the places where they were specific, where the indicators were concrete, and where you could measure, had the biggest impact. But only in places where there was good governance, or at least reasonable governance. And so I think you're asking what the structural constraints are. One is not knowing exactly where you want to go, and then having a government that can deliver those results. And that's why I think it's so important. We had a pretty inclusive process leading up to the development of the post-2015 agenda. I think the UN has done a good job with that, not just with our panel, but more broadly, in trying to be inclusive in getting input. But I think when you get to the country-owned development agenda, that also has to be an inclusive process. So again, the people we've been talking about, the people left out and left behind, the marginalized, young people, et cetera, have to be part of the development of the indicators and targets themselves. Then you can measure them, then you can hold government accountable, and then I think you can achieve real success.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is just the start of what I think will be a whole series of conversations. We've still got 2 more years until we get to post-2015, so I hope you'll join us there, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for a really inspiring conversation.